Don't you just hate it when the creators of something you love get pulled away from the series you loved them for, only for them to go on and make a spiritual successor to it that just isn't as good as the original? Well, that's not what we have here today, because this game proves that Tarsier Studios are the undisputed masters of their craft. My name is St. Corvus, and this is my review of REANIMAL. Anyone that's spent any amount of time watching my videos should immediately be familiar with the name Tarsier Studios, but if you're still lacking the critical information, then here's the summary. They're a Swedish game development studio who got their start making DLCs for the Little Big Planet games, but went on to make the iconic horror platformer games Little Nightmares 1 and 2. I first played Little Nightmares back around 2018 or so because I love weird and creepy media, and something about it caught my eye, but it wasn't until Little Nightmares 2 released back in 2021 that I knew we had something really special here with these developers. If you've seen my recent review of Little Nightmares 3, you'd know how disappointed I was that the game didn't live up to the legacy that Tarsier built, but the shining light at the end of the tunnel was that REANIMAL here looked to be the exact kind of game where Tarsier could go full throttle on everything they'd want to do, with minimal publisher interference. Let's take a look and see where this game met and surpassed my expectations. REANIMAL is a game that at first is very difficult to work out what the story is actually about. That's almost the point of the writing and narrative when it comes to Tarsier's style of storytelling, but I'll give you the basic rundown of what we have here nonetheless. Here we have another adventure of two kids, a brother and a sister, who are looking for their missing friends. They'll have to travel through a horrifically twisted and decayed version of a city that seems to be much closer to the real world than any of Tarsier's previous settings, while escaping from terrifyingly strange and dangerous people and animals on their way to escaping to safety. Make no mistake, even though this is a game about kids escaping a distorted and corrupted city, REANIMAL is a very dark game and does not pull any of its punches. You're not getting some PG family-friendly Burton-esque story here. You better buckle in because you're going to be having yourself a full horror cinematic experience. Tarsier have always been amazing at making a more subtle story and lacing in metaphor and meaning behind their outwardly eerie exterior, but in REANIMAL, they've dove right in with no restraint in a way that makes REANIMAL stand out entirely on its own in the genre, and some later parts of the game had my jaw hanging on the floor. If you're anything like me, and like any of the kinds of horror that I like, you're gonna absolutely adore the story here in REANIMAL. It's the kind of story that will have you thinking about implications and trying to derive meaning every night before you sleep for a week straight, and some of the scenes presented are etched in my short-term memory. One big development when it comes to the narrative of this game is that there are actual spoken lines of dialogue. Little Nightmares 1 and 2 had characters whisper things like, "Hey," but no actual spoken dialogue beyond that, and REANIMAL here does take that leap forward in a way that doesn't destroy the tone they go for. It's tastefully and sparsely used, and it feels like every line said in the game has weight to it. If you're gonna add something to a game like this to try and elevate it, then you better make sure it's done well, and that's exactly what they've done with the dialogue here. That's not all they've done to elevate REANIMAL from their previous games, so let's move on to the gameplay. You likely already know what to expect as far as the core gameplay loop of REANIMAL goes, but in case you're not, let me give you a brief rundown. REANIMAL is a 3D physics-based horror platformer which features puzzle and stealth elements. Across your solo with an AI partner or co-op journey through this ruined city, you'll be doing all the usual things: opening doors, jumping over gaps and obstacles, climbing objects, interacting with objects to solve puzzles, and working with your partner to overcome challenges that bar your progress. You'll still be running away from terrifying monsters and sometimes stealthing your way past them. Anyone that's seen my review of Little Nightmares 3 will know that I stated that Tarsier also adds and innovates on top of their formula with every new game they make, and REANIMAL does exactly that in some very welcome ways. The first major thing to note about the gameplay is combat. Little Nightmares 2 had a very small handful of sections where an axe could be used as a weapon if timed correctly, and Tarsier have taken this concept significantly further and turned combat into a core part of the gameplay loop. Regardless of which character you're playing as, you'll have a weapon as a permanent part of your toolkit to use to fend off enemies. Combat isn't particularly deep, you really just mash the button to perform an infinite attack combo, but this is a horror game, not an action game. Having the concept expanded and solidified is all it needed to be, otherwise you may as well have made this an action game. All this to say, having combat actually be a proper part of the game does feel great for the variety in things you do during the game, and the melee combat is weighty and satisfying to perform. The next major addition to REANIMAL comes in the form of vehicles. Across your playthrough you'll commandeer a number of vehicles such as a boat and a car to either explore more of the world or escape from things in the world. If I'm being fully honest, vehicles were the last thing I would have expected Tarsier to add into their games, but I don't hate it. I actually quite like it. Everything you drive in the game fits in very well, controlled great, and felt like it had purpose for being there. The sections were paced well to either provide a moment of excitement after a long drawn out section, or to give you time to relax and survey after crazy sections. One thing that I did notice about REANIMAL is that while there are a lot of different and great ways that the player will interact with the game and the world, puzzles have taken a bit of a step back compared to what I expected. Tarsier are known for having a lot of puzzles thrown into their games where players have to interact with physics in certain ways to achieve progress, and REANIMAL still had puzzles thrown in every now and then, but much less than I would have thought, and most of the puzzles I came across were quite simple and easy. I'm not saying this as a negative, more to set expectations when it comes to the gameplay style of the game. There's a lot less time spent running around trying to figure out what to do or how to interact with something, and instead a lot more ways that the player will be directly interacting with the game. And the end result is that the player experience feels a lot more like a feature-complete video game than some of Tarsier's back catalogue. As I mentioned, this game can be played either solo or in co-op, and I did my playthrough fully solo, with the second character being controlled by AI. I do have to say that co-op in a game like this seems like an incredibly fun time, but playing solo didn't actually feel like I was missing any part of the experience. There aren't any moments where only one player will be interacting with something or going through a section. All levels and challenges are designed with both players in mind, so you'll have a similar experience regardless of how you play. The AI partner never felt like it was getting in my way or causing any points of frustration either. Whenever I needed it to climb a tall ledge or open a door with me, it was immediately responsive and ready to perform, but left me a good amount of space to explore at my own pace. As you go across your journey, you'll have some cool things to try and find to make exploration feel worthwhile. You can find and pick up multiple different hats that you can swap out from the menu, concept art posters stuck onto walls throughout the game, as well as some boxes that if you find all of, you might get something cool. The levels in REANIMAL feel quite large with a lot of branching paths, and there's almost always something rewarding down the end of one. That's really all there is to talk about regarding the new gameplay features of REANIMAL. It's time to move on to the main section when it comes to these games, and talk about the design. I'm just going to start with the obvious. REANIMAL has one of the most breathtaking art styles of a game that I have ever played. The world somehow looks so realistic, but also stylized in a way that almost no other game is. Character models are so detailed and animated with such fluidity that transfers over to how it feels to move around in the game. The environment designs are absolutely stellar with how lonely, isolating, but also open and broad they can be. There are so many locations such as a train yard, a cinema in a city, a farmhouse on top of a hill, and a desert city that are all in such stark contrast to each other, but all suit the game and each look gorgeous in their own unique way. One part of the visuals that I was majorly impressed by was the lighting. Lighting is one of the only big areas that games have improved visually in the past decade, and REANIMAL shows off exactly what it can do with it. Each character has their own light source that you can turn on, and these light up the rooms so well. The game itself is very dark and haunting by design, which just further highlights how well Tarsier have done their lighting. And the biggest props have to go to the fact that every single thing, every design of every building, character, enemy, and object are all designed in a way that don't just look good, but complement and in fact enhance the atmosphere that this game has. When it comes to the way that the horror itself is done and designed in REANIMAL, you'd be forgiven for thinking that with child protagonists, it's going to be somewhat on the tame side, maybe a bit creepy and unsettling, but ultimately not more than that. That's where you couldn't be more wrong with this game. REANIMAL is dark, it's brutal, it's unflinching, it's unapologetic, and it only gets stronger and stronger the further you get into the game. There are horror games out there like Dead Space and Resident Evil 4 where the horror is guts strewn about the place and monstrous stuff coming out of people's bodies, But REANIMAL is quite different and unique. The horror, both in terms of what you're escaping from and what you come up against, is confronting, grotesque in more of an uncomfortably uncanny way, and often quite deeply psychological. By the time the credits rolled on my playthrough, I wasn't just impressed, but impacted by what I saw and felt. As per usual with a Tarsier game, a key part of what makes the entire experience so great is the soundtrack and sound design in general. Here we have a haunting and oppressive soundtrack that sets and continues to deliver a tone that matches the game perfectly. Gone are the childlike motifs from the Little Nightmares soundtracks. Here the soundtrack is deadly serious and very industrial in its vibe and atmosphere. I know that I've been giving this game some of the highest praise that a game on this channel has received, but I do have two things that I want to criticize here. The first of these is the game length, a topic which is widely discussed not just for REANIMAL here, but for all of Tarsier's catalogue. I'm someone who's very familiar with their style of design and how their games are played, and my runtime from start to finish in one straight session came to a total of 3.5 hours. For context, that's about how long my first playthrough of Little Nightmares 1 lasted, and slightly less than the second game. I don't mind a game being shorter if it means that the product is of extremely high quality, which REANIMAL is in every single facet, but I've always said that I'd love to see their games be just a little longer, like a cool 5.5 to 6 hours long. The game at launch costs $55 Australian on Steam, which is not an expensive price for a game at all, and the quality of the product is astronomically high, but I totally sympathise with people who feel like they don't get enough bang for their buck here. That being said, there is a season pass out which will give 3 new narrative expansions over the next year, which will most likely leave REANIMAL with a runtime of what I hoped for, and I will be re-reviewing the game as a whole package once all 3 of those chapters have been released. There's still reasons to replay the game. I do want to play it in co-op with various people since they can join with a friends pass, but there's still more collectibles and achievements for me to get, so I'm not quite done with it just yet. The second complaint that I have is in regards to the technical performance of the game. Running this at 4K ultra settings on my PC with DLSS on, I had more frames at my disposal than I could ever need, but unfortunately the game did hard crash to desktop roughly each hour that I played. In a big game, a crash or two isn't the end of the world, but in a 3.5 hour game, for it to entirely crash 3 times, it was something that took me out of the experience a little bit, and I hope that Tarsier are able to address this sooner rather than later. All in all, I have to say that REANIMAL shows that 6 years later, Tarsier aren't just up to form, they've only gotten better at what they do best as the years have gone by. This game is undeniable proof that the first 2 Little Nightmares games weren't flukes. They weren't amazing on accident. Tarsier know exactly how to make an incredibly impactful and cinematic horror experience, while also never stopping with how they can add and improve gameplay elements to keep players engaged. For positives, we have an intriguing setup for a plot that only gets better as the game goes on, monster and enemy designs that are genuinely disturbing and unique, refined gameplay from what the studio is known for, additions to gameplay that make the experience feel feature complete, puzzles that work seamlessly for either solo or co-op and don't ruin either experience, absolutely incredible level design with larger areas and more side paths than ever before, an incredible soundtrack and an art style and visuals that will leave an impression on gaming as a whole. For negatives, we have somewhat frequent crashing on the PC version, as well as a fairly short runtime if you don't get too stuck or lost in any particular areas. Due to the following reasons, I'll be giving REANIMAL a score of 9.5 out of 10. I will be honest, I did really want to give the game a perfect 10, but until the crashes are fixed and there's a little more content here, I just can't give it a fully perfect rating. I'm very keen to see what the 3 story DLC chapters end up being like, because if they do end up having the same level of quality as the base game, then I can only see this as getting a perfect score when I re-review it. For now, I do have to leave the score there. Tarsier Studios well and truly are the GOAT. If you've made it to the end of this review and you enjoyed the video or found it informative, then please consider subscribing to the channel. It would help out immensely. Thanks for watching, guys. See ya.